What if I told you that the most refined people of the Victorian age, those draped in silk, surrounded by servants, and obsessed with moral purity, slept every single night with a pot of fermenting human urine just inches from their faces, and considered this the height of civilized living? Picture the elegant townhouses of London, the grand country estates we see in period dramas, with their polished mahogany furniture and heavy velvet drapes. Now imagine lifting those embroidered bed skirts to reveal ceramic vessels, often stained yellow with dried residue, quietly collecting the family's most intimate waste throughout the long, cold night. This wasn't the mark of poverty or primitive living. This was standard practice in the wealthiest households across Britain. The same society that built railways spanning continents and engineered sewage systems serving millions kept chamber pots beneath their beds and thought nothing peculiar about it. The contradiction seems absurd to our modern sensibilities, yet it reveals a profound truth about the gap between Victorian public image and private reality. To understand why requires us to step into their world, to feel the bone-deep cold of unheated bedrooms, to hear the creak of floorboards in pitch darkness, and to recognize that what seems strange to us was perfectly logical within the constraints of their time. The Victorian era was built on illusions, and perhaps none was more carefully maintained than the illusion of cleanliness. Scratch beneath the surface of that gilded age, and you'll discover a society living in intimate proximity to its own waste, trapped between the demands of biology and the rigid expectations of respectability. The chamber pot under the bed becomes a perfect metaphor for Victorian civilization itself, elegant on the surface, but hiding uncomfortable truths in the shadows beneath. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Necessity. To understand the chamber pot's persistence, we must first grasp the physical reality of Victorian homes. These structures were designed according to principles entirely different from modern houses, where bathrooms are distributed throughout and plumbing runs invisibly through walls. Victorian homes, particularly those built before mid-century, were vertical mazes of narrow staircases and unheated corridors, with the family's private quarters located on upper floors to escape street noise and odors. Consider a typical upper-middle-class London townhouse in the 1850s. The building rose 3 or 4 stories, requiring anyone in the bedrooms to descend 60 or 70 steps to reach ground level. The single water closet, if one existed, might be located in a cold rear extension, or, more commonly, in an outdoor privy in the back garden. Now imagine making that treacherous journey on a winter night, in complete darkness, wearing only a thin nightgown, with temperatures inside the house hovering near freezing. Victorian homes were not heated as we understand heating today. Central heating was rare and expensive throughout most of the era. Bedrooms might have fireplaces, but these were typically banked overnight to conserve coal and reduce fire risk. The hallways and staircases received no heat whatsoever. Walking through these spaces in the dark, guided only by a flickering candle, over floors slick with condensation, posed genuine physical danger. The staircases themselves were often steep and narrow, designed to maximize living space in cramped urban lots. Victorian literature's frequent references to people falling downstairs weren't merely dramatic devices. Navigating multiple flights in darkness was genuinely hazardous. The architecture extended beyond mere placement of facilities. Victorian bedrooms were designed with chamber pots in mind. Bedside cabinets called commodes were specifically built to house these vessels, with doors or drawers that concealed them while keeping them easily accessible. In wealthier homes, these were elaborate pieces of furniture that matched the bedroom decor, bearing no obvious indication of their true function. Some were so well disguised that visitors might never realize what they contained. But the architectural challenges ran deeper still. Even homes connected to new sewer lines often had inadequate or poorly maintained connections. Sewer gases could back up into water closets, creating foul odors and what Victorians believed were disease-carrying miasmas. In rural areas, grand estates relied on cesspits, essentially large underground tanks that collected waste and required periodic emptying by night soil men. When these systems became full or blocked, the entire arrangement could back up into the house, making chamber pots not just convenient, but essential backup systems. The persistence of chamber pots, even as plumbing technology improved, reveals something crucial about Victorian society's relationship with change. Houses were expensive investments, and most families couldn't afford to rebuild simply to accommodate new plumbing. Even those who could were often reluctant to tear apart perfectly functional homes for what seemed like minor improvements. The chamber pot worked. It had always worked, and there was comfort in maintaining familiar routines even as the world outside changed rapidly. Yet this architectural necessity created a peculiar intimacy with waste that shaped every aspect of Victorian domestic life. The bedroom, that supposed sanctuary of rest and privacy, became a space where the air grew heavy with coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the inevitable rising scent of the chamber pot. The luxury was merely a veneer stretched over a reality that would horrify modern sensibilities. But who maintained this illusion? Who made it possible for the wealthy to sleep above their own waste without having to confront it directly? Chapter 2. The Hidden Economy of Waste. At dawn, while the household still slept, the real machinery of Victorian domestic life began to turn. In the narrow servants' corridors below stairs, a young housemaid, perhaps 14 years old, her hands already reddened and chapped from constant exposure to harsh cleaning agents, prepared for one of her most unpleasant daily tasks. The emptying of the chamber pots was a ritual performed in silence, a choreographed dance of disgust and necessity that kept the illusion of genteel cleanliness intact. Picture her ascending those steep servants' stairs, carrying a heavy tin pail, moving with practiced stealth to avoid waking the family. She would enter each bedroom like a ghost, locating the chamber pot and extracting it without allowing the contents to slosh or spill. Every drop that stained the expensive carpets was evidence of failure, a mark against her competence that could cost her position. The concentrated smell in these moments was overwhelming, a sharp ammoniac assault that made her eyes water and her stomach turn. But here the story takes an unexpected turn that most histories omit. We assume this waste was simply discarded, thrown into cesspits or drains to be forgotten. In reality, Victorian society was built on an economy of waste that turned even human excrement into valuable commodities. Nothing was truly discarded in an age before synthetic chemicals and mass production. Human urine, when allowed to stale and ferment, becomes rich in ammonia, a crucial industrial chemical in the 19th century. This ammonia was the lifeblood of textile and leather industries, used as a mordant to set dyes in fabric and to bleach wool. Most significantly, it was essential in leather tanning, where animal hides were soaked in vats of aged urine to remove hair and soften the skin. The irony is profound. The same waste that Victorian ladies hid beneath their beds was used to create the soft leather gloves they wore to evening parties, the supple boots that graced their feet, the fine bindings on the books that lined their libraries. This economic value created a bizarre underground market. In London's poorest districts, there existed collectors known as pure finders, usually elderly women or destitute men who roamed the streets with buckets, purchasing urine from households or collecting it from public facilities to sell to tanneries and dye works. While wealthy families likely didn't engage in such direct commerce, that would be far too vulgar, their servants understood the value of what they handled daily. In rural estates, chamber pot contents were carefully composted to fertilize kitchen gardens. The strawberries served at summer garden parties were literally nourished by the nitrogen harvested from the master's bedroom. The maid carrying the slop pail was thus more than a cleaner. She was moving resources through an intricate economy where waste became wealth. She bore the smell and the shame, so her employers could maintain their dignified distance from biological reality. But this system depended on a vast supply of cheap labor willing to perform these degrading tasks. The chamber pot could only exist as a genteel solution because someone else was willing to deal with its consequences. The servants' own living conditions reflected this hierarchy of waste management. Maids typically slept in tiny attic rooms, often sharing beds and certainly sharing chamber pots among themselves. But who emptied their chamber pots? Usually the lowest-ranking servant, or they took turns, creating a microcosm of the larger household hierarchy, where even among the powerless there were gradations of dignity and unpleasant duties. This economic dimension reveals the chamber pot as more than a convenience. It was a tool of class control. As long as servants remained plentiful and cheap, there was little incentive for wealthy families to invest in extensive plumbing renovations. Why spend hundreds of pounds installing multiple water closets when a few shillings per week could employ someone to handle the chamber pots? The system worked efficiently from the employer's perspective, while the comfort or dignity of servants was rarely considered in household management decisions. But this arrangement was becoming unstable as the Victorian era progressed. Servants were finding other opportunities in shops, factories, and offices, jobs that might pay less but offered more freedom and dignity. The labor shortage that plagued middle-class households by the late Victorian period would ultimately prove more decisive in ending the chamber pot's reign than any technological advancement. Yet even as the servant problem grew acute, the wealthy clung to their chamber pots for reasons that went beyond mere convenience. There were deeper forces at work, medical beliefs and social anxieties that made these vessels seem not just practical, but essential to proper living. Chapter 3. Medical Mythology and the Prison of Propriety. Victorian medicine operated according to principles that seem bizarre today. Yet they provided powerful justification for keeping chamber pots conveniently located beneath beds. The dominant medical theory of the era, miasma, held that diseases spread through foul air, through invisible clouds of corruption emanating from rotting organic matter and human waste. This wasn't entirely wrong. Cholera and typhoid did correlate with poor sanitation. But Victorians misunderstood the mechanism, believing the smell itself was dangerous, that breathing bad air directly caused illness. Night air was considered especially perilous. Medical texts warned that air cooled at night became heavier and more likely to carry harmful miasmas close to the ground where people might breathe them. Temperature changes were thought to concentrate these dangerous influences, making nighttime exposure particularly risky. Doctors advised keeping bedroom windows closed after dark, creating stuffy, oxygen-depleted environments that were actually less healthy than fresh air would have been. In this context, remaining in one's bedroom rather than venturing into hallways or outdoors to a privy was considered medically prudent. The concerns were especially acute for women, viewed as more delicate and vulnerable to environmental dangers. Victorian medical literature overflowed with warnings about risks women faced from exposure to cold, damp, or night air. Pregnant women received particular cautions against unnecessary exertion or exposure. The walk to a distant water closet through cold hallways in the middle of the night was precisely the sort of activity doctors warned could lead to illness or complications. The chamber pot eliminated this risk entirely. Children were another group considered especially vulnerable. Victorian childhood was genuinely dangerous. Infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high. Parents were understandably anxious about anything that might threaten their children's health. The idea of a young child navigating dark hallways and stairs to reach a water closet at night was unthinkable to many Victorian parents. Chamber pots in the nursery weren't just convenient, they were seen as essential protection for vulnerable young lives. But medical justifications went beyond miasma theory. Victorian doctors worried about the physical strain of nighttime toilet trips. They believed the body was weakened during sleep, that vital forces were diminished, and that sudden exertion could be harmful. Rising from a warm bed and walking through cold spaces was thought to create dangerous shock to the system. This was particularly concerning for elderly people or those with heart conditions, for whom exertion and temperature change could supposedly trigger serious medical events. There was also a peculiar Victorian obsession with bladder and kidney function. Medical texts suggested that holding urine too long could cause kidney problems or bladder infections, yet they simultaneously warned against too frequent urination, seen as evidence of weakness or nervous disorder. The chamber pot offered a middle path. One could relieve oneself when necessary without the exertion of a long walk, but the slight inconvenience might discourage frivolous trips. The irony, of course, is that chamber pots themselves posed genuine health risks that Victorian medicine failed to recognize. Even when cleaned daily, they were sources of bacterial contamination. Keeping them in bedrooms, sometimes for hours after use, allowed harmful bacteria to spread through the air or contaminate surfaces. The servants who handled them were exposed to pathogens that could cause serious illness. But because Victorian medicine didn't understand germ theory until late in the era, these real dangers remained invisible, while imaginary threats from night air loomed large. These medical beliefs intersected with social anxieties to create an elaborate system of propriety that made chamber pots not just practical, but socially necessary. In polite Victorian society, one simply didn't discuss bodily functions. The very words for elimination were considered too crude for refined conversation. Victorians developed an intricate vocabulary of euphemisms. One excused oneself or retired or, in the most delicate phrasing, answered a call of nature. The actual mechanics were never mentioned, creating a social fiction that refined people somehow transcended such base necessities. This attitude shaped Victorian water closet design in ways that reinforced chamber pot utility. Water closets were placed away from main living areas, often in separate small rooms or outdoor structures. This placement was partly practical, related to plumbing requirements, but also deliberately maintained the fiction that bodily functions didn't intrude on civilized life. The very act of excusing oneself and walking to a water closet was public acknowledgement of bodily needs, causing genuine embarrassment to many Victorians. The chamber pot offered escape from this social anxiety. One could answer nature's call in bedroom privacy without any public acknowledgement of what was occurring. There was no need to excuse oneself from company, no risk of being seen walking toward the water closet, no possibility that others might hear sounds or smell odors that would betray what was happening. The chamber pot allowed bodily functions to remain truly private, invisible to everyone except servants, and servants in the Victorian worldview didn't count as real observers because they existed in a separate social sphere. But this elaborate system of denial and concealment was creating consequences that would eventually overwhelm even Victorian determination to maintain proper appearances. The collective refusal to acknowledge waste was leading to a literal poisoning of their world, a crisis that would force them to confront the gap between their pristine self-image and the filthy reality beneath. Chapter 4: The Dark Consequences of Collective Denial. Step outside the perfumed bedroom, and the carefully maintained illusions shatter completely. The same society that hid chamber pots behind embroidered screens was pouring its collective waste into the open arteries of the city. London's streets, especially before the great sanitary reforms of mid-century, were streaked with filth, animal dung from horses, refuse from markets, runoff from slaughterhouses, and human waste finding its way into gutters and, ultimately, the Thames. The urine collected so discreetly in bedroom pots became part of a much larger flood of contamination. In working-class neighborhoods, the reality was brutal. Entire families might share a single outdoor privy, its pit slowly filling over months. Chamber pots, often just simple pails, multiplied under beds, beneath chairs, in corners of crowded rooms. On cold nights, walking to the privy meant risking frostbite, illness, or assault in dangerous neighborhoods. So people used what they had, and the waste accumulated in living spaces where children played and families ate. The contents of millions of chamber pots had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was increasingly inadequate cesspools, brick-lined pits in house basements meant to be emptied regularly. But landlords, driven by greed and negligence, often let them overflow. The porous brick leaked, and liquid waste seeped through foundations into soil and groundwater. Victorian homes, for all their velvet and polish, were literally sitting on lakes of excrement. This reality gave birth to the miasma theory, the belief that diseases like cholera and typhoid were caused by bad air or smells. Victorians were wrong about the mechanism, but right about the source. The smell of the chamber pot was indeed the smell of death. When the Great Stink of 1858 hit London, summer heat caused the sewage-filled Thames to ferment, creating a stench so powerful it shut down Parliament. Curtains dipped in chloride of lime couldn't keep it out. The chamber pot now reveals its sinister aspect. It represented the hoarding of filth, the privatization of a public problem. The wealthy could pay servants to carry pots away, but they couldn't pay for waste to disappear. It simply moved next door, into rivers, into basements. The privacy of the chamber pot was an illusion because the consequences were inevitably public. Cholera didn't respect etiquette or class boundaries. When water supplies were contaminated by seepage from thousands of cesspools, bacteria killed princes and paupers alike. The Victorian obsession with hiding waste, with keeping it private under beds, directly contributed to delays in building public sewage systems. They resisted state interference in their water closets, preferring to keep their business under their own control. The economic dimension of waste had created perverse incentives. The ammonia trade that made urine valuable also made proper disposal less urgent. Why build expensive sewers when waste could be sold? The leather and textile industries that depended on aged urine had powerful interests in maintaining the status quo. The pure finders and night soil men who collected waste for commercial use formed an entire economy built on the assumption that human waste was a resource, not a problem to be eliminated. But the system was collapsing under its own weight. As cities swelled with millions of new residents drawn by industrial jobs, the informal networks that had managed waste for centuries couldn't cope. The farms that had once absorbed night soil were too distant from urban centers. The cesspools were overflowing faster than they could be emptied. The rivers were dying under the load of sewage and industrial waste. It was only when death tolls became catastrophic that Victorians were forced to abandon their cherished privacy. The construction of London's great sewer system by Joseph Bazalgette wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a cultural defeat. It was an admission that individuals couldn't manage their own waste, that the chamber pot system had failed. The transition to flush toilets was slow and resisted. Many aristocrats found water closets vulgar. The noise of the flush, the mechanical complexity, seemed too industrial. They preferred the silent, deadly dignity of the pot. The irony is profound. The Victorians built an empire on which the sun never set. connected continents with railways, and created the first modern industrial economy. Yet they couldn't solve the basic problem of where to put their own waste. Their obsession with individual privacy and propriety prevented them from acknowledging that waste management was a collective responsibility requiring collective solutions. The chamber pot under the bed becomes a perfect metaphor for Victorian civilization itself, elegant appearances maintained through the systematic concealment of uncomfortable truths. The cost of this concealment was paid in cholera epidemics, poisoned rivers, and the shortened lives of those who couldn't afford to distance themselves from the consequences of collective denial. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the chamber pot's days were numbered. New technologies, changing social attitudes, and the harsh lessons of public health disasters were converging to make its continued use first unnecessary, then genuinely obsolete. But its disappearance would mark more than just a change in bathroom habits. It would signal the end of an entire way of thinking about privacy, responsibility, and the relationship between individual comfort and collective welfare. Chapter 5. The End of an Era. The chamber pot didn't vanish overnight. Its decline was gradual, uneven, and often reluctant, stretching from the late Victorian period well into the 20th century. Understanding its final disappearance requires examining the convergence of forces that made its continued use first impractical, then impossible to justify. Technology played the most obvious role. By the 1880s and 1890s, flush toilets were becoming more reliable and less expensive. Early water closets had been temperamental, prone to freezing, clogging, and allowing sewer gases to escape. But continuous improvements addressed these problems. The invention of the U-bend trap used water to seal off sewer gases. Better valve mechanisms made toilets more dependable. These advances gradually overcame Victorian resistance based on legitimate functionality concerns. Electric lighting was equally transformative. One major argument for chamber pots had been the danger of navigating dark houses at night. With electric lights, this concern evaporated. A simple switch could illuminate hallways and stairs, making nighttime trips to water closets safe and easy. The psychological barrier of venturing into darkness was removed, eliminating one key justification for keeping chamber pots close at hand. Central heating also contributed to the chamber pot's decline. As more homes installed furnaces and radiators that maintained warmth throughout the night, the discomfort of leaving a warm bed for cold hallways diminished. The physical ordeal Victorians had faced during winter nights became a minor inconvenience rather than genuine hardship. Comfort and convenience now pointed toward using proper water closets, but the most decisive factor was the decline of domestic service. The chamber pot system had depended on cheap, plentiful servants willing to perform unpleasant tasks. As this labor force shrank, the true cost and inconvenience of chamber pots became apparent to middle and upper classes who had previously relied on them. Emptying and cleaning one's own chamber pot was vastly different from having servants do it. Suddenly, the walk to a water closet seemed far less onerous than dealing with chamber pots personally. The world wars accelerated these trends dramatically. Social upheavals broke down many Victorian conventions and hierarchies. Women who had worked in factories and offices during wartime were less willing to return to domestic service afterward. The servant shortage became a crisis, and middle-class households that had once employed several servants found themselves managing with one or none. In this new reality, chamber pots were simply impractical. Yet even then, the chamber pot didn't disappear entirely. In rural areas, older homes, and among elderly people who had grown up with them, chamber pots persisted well into the mid-20th century. They remained common in hospitals and nursing homes as practical devices for patients who couldn't easily reach bathrooms. Some people kept them as emergency backups, tucked away for use during plumbing failures or illness. There's something poignant about the chamber pot's long goodbye. It had been such an integral part of domestic life for so long that its absence marked a genuine rupture with the past. The generation that grew up without chamber pots lived in houses that would have been unrecognizable to their Victorian grandparents, not just because of plumbing, but because of all the social assumptions and practices built around these simple ceramic vessels. Looking back from our modern vantage point, we can see the Victorian chamber pot as a lens through which to view an entire society's contradictions and complexities. It reveals a world simultaneously advancing rapidly and clinging to old ways, building sewage systems for cities while keeping waste vessels under beds, prizing cleanliness and propriety while relying on practices that seem unsanitary to modern eyes. The chamber pot tells us that progress is never simple or straightforward, that people don't abandon familiar practices just because better alternatives exist, and that the gap between public image and private reality is often wider than we imagine. The Victorians kept urine under their beds not because they were backward or ignorant, but because it made sense within the constraints and beliefs of their world. Their homes were designed for it, their social codes demanded it, their medical theories justified it, and their economic system enabled it. When those conditions changed, when architecture, attitudes, labor relations, and technologies all shifted simultaneously, only then did the chamber pot finally disappear from beneath Victorian beds and into the museums where we now view it with fascination and disbelief. Philosophical reflection. What lies beneath our own beds? As we look back at the Victorian era with its chamber pots and elaborate systems of waste concealment, it's tempting to feel superior in our tiled bathrooms with antiseptic flushes. We laugh at the idea of sleeping above a pot of fermenting urine. We shudder at the thought of pure finders collecting waste in buckets. We congratulate ourselves on having transcended such primitive arrangements. But are we truly so different? The Victorian chamber pot was the ultimate symbol of out of sight, out of mind. As long as waste was hidden under beds, covered by decorated lids, and removed by invisible servants, the wealthy could pretend it didn't exist. They pushed the reality of their biological existence into dark corners and paid others to manage the consequences. Today, we've simply perfected the Victorian art of denial. We flush our waste away with a single lever, and it travels through miles of pipes to treatment plants we never see, handled by workers we never meet, processed by systems we don't understand. We've built a longer, more efficient distance between ourselves and our biology, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. We consume, we waste, we flush, and we assume that away is a magical place where consequences dissolve. The Victorians lived with their waste intimately. They slept above it, smelled it, were forced to acknowledge its presence even as they tried to hide it. In a strange way, they were more connected to the reality of their human condition than we are. Their luxury was a thin veneer over cold, hard truth, that to be human is to be messy, that comfort comes at a cost, and that no amount of gold leaf can hide the fact that we are ultimately biological creatures fighting against the decay of time. Our modern sanitation systems are marvels of engineering and public health, genuinely superior to Victorian arrangements in almost every way. But they've also enabled a kind of magical thinking about waste and consequences that the Victorians, for all their denial, couldn't quite achieve. We've made the chamber pot invisible not by hiding it under beds, but by making it disappear entirely from our consciousness. The question we might ask ourselves is this: what practices of our own time, what things we consider normal and necessary, will future generations look back on with the same puzzled wonder? What are we keeping under our own metaphorical beds? What environmental costs? What hidden labor? What displaced consequences that we prefer not to acknowledge? Perhaps the true lesson of the Victorian chamber pot isn't about plumbing or progress, but about the human tendency to solve problems by pushing them somewhere else, to maintain comfort by making discomfort invisible, and to preserve dignity by transferring indignity to others. The chamber pot is gone, but the impulse it represented, the desire to keep unpleasant realities at arm's length, remains as powerful as ever. Was it wealth that defined the Victorians, or was it their ability to hide the quiet miseries and messy truths beneath their polished surfaces? And if we're honest about our own lives, our own systems of waste and consumption and hidden costs, what would that say about us? The chamber pot under the Victorian bed was more than a convenience. It was a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of an entire civilization. When we look into that mirror today, what do we see reflected back? What do you think? Could you have survived the sensory reality of a Victorian night, with its cold, darkness, and intimate proximity to waste? Or do you think our modern distance from such realities has made us lose touch with important truths about human existence? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to explore more hidden stories that challenge our assumptions about the past, make sure to follow along. Because history is full of secrets hiding in the shadows, waiting to be discovered.